God's, you know what, actually, I can't say that word in church. Deacon Haley and I were talking the other day, and I won't say what word we said, but we were talking about how sometimes God can be frustrating, right? I don't remember what exactly we were talking about. Maybe the way that God calls you to do things, and then you're like, no, thank you, I don't care to do that. And then God's like, remember how I asked you to do this? And then you're like, no, thank you. And so on it goes. Or the way that God brings to your attention your own flaws and inadequacies in the gentlest but firmest of ways, draws light and attention to things you were rather trying to ignore. Or maybe we're just talking about the book of Job. If you're not familiar with the book of Job, basically it's about 30 chapters of Job's friends, and believe me, the quotes are fully proper in that sentence. His friends coming to explain to him why he's lost everything, right? His house, his wealth, his health, his children. Can you imagine visiting someone that you call a friend at the hospital or bringing a casserole after some kind of horrible tragedy and saying, well, maybe you should have prayed more, you know? Or if only you weren't such a horrible sinner. Not helpful. So that's why we don't usually read those 30 chapters on Sunday mornings. You get the gist of it. Not helpful. And it's especially bad because if you read the first chapters of Job, then you know that the actual reason that Job lost everything is because God and Satan made a bet, right? This is true. Satan said, I bet if you take everything from this guy, he won't be as faithful. So when you wonder why bad things happen to good people, it's because Satan and God are playing dice with our lives, apparently. Although, I will say, when God finally shows up, which is what we read from today, that's not what God says, right? In fact, God answers Job's question of why is this happening to me that Job keeps asking throughout the book with another question, or a series of questions. Kind of reminds you of Jesus, right? Like father, like son, I guess. God says, did you make the world? Do you know how to make it rain? Can you make the lightning happen? You know how to take care of the animals? Make sure all the plants, make sure the world runs? That's God's answer, right? God doesn't even go so far as to say, I'm God, you're not, sit down, right? God just asks the questions to help Job realize, maybe I don't quite know what's going on here in the whole magnitude of the universe. Maybe things are a little more complicated than that. And maybe it's the right answer. Maybe it's even a good answer. But it's probably not the answer that Job was hoping for, right? Or maybe not. Which is kind of how I feel about the holy orders of the Episcopal Church. They might be good, they might be right, but are they quite what we're looking for? I don't know. I mean, I know the Bible says all these things, right? We've had priests and deacons and bishops since the beginning of time. Well, at least since the beginning of the church, right? And here we are, St. Stephen's, right? We're named after the very first deacon. His picture's around here somewhere, getting ordained, one of these stained glass windows. And then there's this whole bit with Melchizedek, which I'm pretty sure is only in the Bible, so that people like me have to say Melchizedek as many times as possible in a sermon. But he was a priest before they even knew priests existed, right? Abraham brought Melchizedek gifts, the first fruits of his labors, as a sign and offering to God before there was even an Aaronic priesthood, before there was even any kind of organized religion. Because there has to be somebody, right? There has to be somebody who takes care of the gathered community. There has to be somebody who ministers to people. There has to be somebody who carries on the rituals and traditions of our faith. And that's why we have ordained ministers, at least in part. But the problem is, somewhere along the line, we got this idea that the ordained people, are somehow a little bit closer to God. I'm not able to roll my eyes quite enough to indicate how I feel about that. But I think we can all say that's not quite right. But I wonder, is that where James and John got their idea? They're like, hey, we're disciples, man. We've been following this guy around. We've been listening to his crazy questions. We got to get something out of this. Can't we sit at your right hand? And Jesus doesn't quite immediately lay into them and say, stop being ridiculous. It's actually the other disciples. Did you notice that? The other disciples got angry. And that might be because they were jealous that they hadn't asked the question first. They were afraid the seat got taken, But I don't think that was it. I think the disciples, just like us, knew that's a ridiculous question, right? Think about the greatest human being you've ever known of. You can't pick Jesus, that's cheating. We all know Jesus. Another one, pick another one, right? Was that person great because of all their accomplishments or their wealth or their power? I mean, those things might have been a part of who they are. But what made them great, I'm willing to bet, is how they treated people. Maybe how they treated you, is what they valued, the way that they lived. Even if you'd never heard today's gospel before, I'm betting you know that what makes people great is not the same things that the world so often tells us makes people great, right? Not the power, the prestige, the money, the whatever. Those things can be used for good, but what makes people great is how they live and how they treat people. We know that, but unfortunately, as a church, we've kind of gotten misguided, right? We took this beautiful teaching and we smushed it into the format we know, right? So the greatest example of this for me is when we walk into church. Now, Deacon Jan tried to blow my illustration this morning by going in front of the choir, but she's not supposed to. But you got to give her a break. It's her first Sunday here. So in a procession into church, the bishop is the last person, right? Because she's the most important. Get it? The last shall be first, right? And then come the priests, and then come the deacons, and then whatever lay people, which is what we call people who don't get ordained, we allow to be in the procession, right? They're in the first, but that's really because they're least important. Except that's not what Jesus meant, right? The idea isn't let's smush, the way to be greatest is to be the last, so let's get to the end of a line so we can be the greatest. That's not it, right? We fall all over ourselves trying to show who's the most humble and who can get out of the way. We're just trying to turn the system on its head and say that the first people are the last and the last people are the first, which is what Jesus said. But what he really meant is, let's tear this whole thing down, right? Let's have a whole nother way of thinking about what is good and what is great and what is important. Jesus said, the Gentiles, which I take in this gospel to mean the leadership of the world, right? The people outside of our faith tradition, they tell us that leaders lord it over people, that they're tyrants, right? Not so with you. Not so with you. For you to be a leader is something different. And yes, all we know is lead and follow. And so we'd say, the best leaders are followers. I understand why we think that. But the truth is, Jesus was trying to say, get out of this game altogether, right? Don't play by different rules. Create a whole nother game where what we value is each other and God. Or as Lily Tomlin, the comedian, said it so perfectly, the trouble with the rat race is even if you win, you're still a rat, right? Jesus wanted more for us than that. Today, as we welcome officially Deacon Haley into our congregation, I've got to tell you, Deacon Haley is also a priest. Did it blow your mind? That's because you're also priest. What? If you don't believe me, look at the back of the baptismal ritual, right? We welcome everybody into the priesthood of all believers. All of us, when we choose to follow Jesus, are recognizing that we've been given gifts to be a part of what Christ and God are doing in this world. And we use those gifts in service of God. And that's a big part of what being a priest is. And, wait for it, I'm also a deacon. Am I blowing your mind yet? Right? Because everybody, right, deacons, priests, bishops, we are all ordained first as deacons. And contrary to popular opinion, that is not because it's the lowest rank. It's because it's foundational, right? It's foundational. It's the most important ministry. If you want to serve God in this church, you must first serve God's people and empower them to do God's work in this world. And that is what deacons do. And that, frankly, is what all of us, as baptized Christians, are meant to be doing. Now, I don't know if it's fair to say that Job thought he could do a better job than God. But you can understand that when we question, right, why is this happening to me? What's going on here? What's wrong here? Couldn't this be done a better way? We're kind of questioning the person or the entity, the God, who makes everything happen. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying to stop asking your questions, right? Because questions are an important part of our faith, right? Our doubts, our struggles. God takes it all. God can handle it. There's nothing wrong with thinking, this might have gone better, at least for me, if I was in charge. But the problem is, I'm not in charge, despite the funny clothes and standing in front. And neither are you, neither are any of us. God's in charge. And God, who is in charge, wanted us to understand being in charge in a fundamentally different way. Not about being the best or the tallest or the strongest or having the most wealth, but being a people who serve, who seek first, what would God have me do? And how can I be of service to the people who are a part of this community and the people who are beyond our walls? That is the fundamental call for each of us as baptized Christian, no matter what kind of funny clothes we have or what kind of titles we have. Or as YouTube, one of my favorite lines from YouTube puts it, if you want to touch the sky, you got to learn how to kneel.